The French Revolution had begun with a promise of freedom. It had sworn to overthrow tyranny, to bring justice to the people, and to create a new, enlightened world. But by 1794, that dream was dead. Instead of justice, the revolution had given birth to paranoia, cruelty, and terror. The streets of Paris were now ruled by the guillotine. The prisons overflowed, the gutters ran red, and no one was safe. Nobles, priests, peasants, and revolutionaries alike were dragged to the scaffold, accused of treason without proof, condemned without trial. The reign of terror had already claimed thousands of lives, but in its final days, as France descended even further into madness, the executions became even more extreme, even more brutal. Some people were not simply killed, they were tortured, drowned, experimented on, and, if the darkest rumors were true, even eaten. This is the final, bloodiest chapter of the revolution. By 1794, Paris had become a city of starvation. The revolution had destroyed the monarchy, the nobility, and the old social order, but it had also destroyed France's economy. Food was running out, bread was scarce, meat was expensive, and for many, starvation was just as terrifying as the guillotine. And then, the whispers began. In the poorer districts of Paris, rumors spread that certain butchers never ran out of meat. Even when food shortages were at their worst, even when other markets had nothing left to sell, these shops always had fresh cuts. At first, people didn't ask questions. They were too hungry to care. But then, someone did. According to accounts that surfaced years later, a customer at a Parisian butcher shop became suspicious when she noticed that the cuts of meat looked unusual, too pale, too soft, too similar to something disturbingly familiar. Then came the most terrifying claim of all. Some of the butchered flesh still had tattooed skin attached to it. The whispers turned into full-blown panic. The revolution had killed so many people that the mass graves were overflowing. The guillotine never stopped, and if some desperate, depraved individuals had found a way to profit off the corpses, what was stopping them? There was never any official investigation, no trials, no arrests. But the rumors alone were enough to send waves of fear through Paris. Were the people of France, who had fought to destroy the monarchy, now consuming their own dead? Or was it just another symptom of a city driven mad by hunger, terror, and the ever-present stench of death? Either way, the fear of cannibalism was nothing compared to what happened next. Because soon, the revolutionaries discovered a far more efficient way to kill, a way to execute thousands at once, a way to erase people from existence, without a single drop of blood left behind. The guillotine had been effective, but slow. The prisons were overflowing with enemies of the revolution. The government needed a new way to purge the traitors. And so, in the city of Nantes, a man named Jean-Baptiste Carrier devised a new method of execution. He called it the National Baths. It was simple. Thousands of prisoners, men, women, and children were dragged from their cells, stripped naked, and tied together in large groups. Then, they were herded onto barges and taken out onto the dark waters of the Loire River. And once they were far enough from shore, the executioners sank the boats. The prisoners, still bound together, were left to drown, screaming, thrashing against the water, pulling each other down into the depths. Some tried to break free. Others pleaded for their lives. It didn't matter. None of them survived. Over the course of 4 months, more than 4,000 people were drowned in the Loire River. Some were pregnant women. Some were elderly nobles who could barely walk. Some were teenagers, guilty of nothing except being related to an aristocrat. And when the bodies washed up on the riverbanks, bloated and rotting, the revolutionaries simply shoved them back into the water. The national baths became a horror even other revolutionaries found difficult to justify. Carrier himself bragged about his mass executions, calling them a necessary cleansing of France. But even this was not enough to satisfy the revolution. The killings had no rules, no limits. Not even children and the elderly were spared. The revolution had once claimed to fight for the people, but by 1794, even the most helpless members of society were being slaughtered. Elderly aristocrats were dragged from their homes, thrown into carts, and taken to the guillotine. Some could barely stand, their frail bodies too weak to fight back. Teenagers, even children as young as 14, were accused of treason and sentenced to death. One of the most infamous cases was the execution of the Dauphin's governess, Madame de Tourzel. She was an old woman, frail, loyal to the monarchy, but harmless. None of that mattered. She was paraded through the streets, mocked, beaten, and finally beheaded before a cheering crowd. And she was not the only one. Any child who had noble blood was seen as a threat to the revolution's future. Some were executed by guillotine, others were drowned in the Loire River. By this point, there were no rules. There was only blood. And in the depths of the revolution's hidden prisons, even darker horrors were taking place. The guillotine had turned the streets of Paris into a theatre of death, but inside the prisons of the revolution, an entirely different kind of horror was taking place. Not everyone accused of treason was executed immediately. Some were thrown into secret prisons, left to rot in filthy cells, subjected to bizarre experiments, and driven to the brink of madness. These prisons became laboratories of cruelty, where the revolutionaries tested just how much suffering a human being could endure before breaking completely. And the worst part? No one outside the prison walls could hear the screams. The hell of La Force prison, the city of the damned. One of the most notorious prisons was La Force, originally built as a debtor's prison, but converted by the revolution into a holding pen for enemies of the state. It became so overcrowded that prisoners were forced to sleep in piles, their bodies pressed against the filth-covered stone. Diseases rampaged through the cells. The air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh, human waste, and decay. But the true terror of La Force was not just the conditions, it was the psychological torture. The guards made a game of tormenting the prisoners, whispering false rumors, toying with their emotions, and playing cruel tricks on their already fragile minds. One of their favorite tortures was to randomly enter a cell and announce that someone had been pardoned. A prisoner, delirious with hope, would be led out, believing they had been granted freedom, only to be taken directly to the guillotine. Those left behind would hear the faint sound of the blade falling, followed by the cheers of the crowd outside. The hope of survival was torture in itself. And then there were the experiments. While La Force was known for its psychological cruelty, Bicêtre prison became infamous for something far worse. The guards here were not content to simply watch prisoners suffer. They wanted to study their pain. There were reports, some official, others whispered in fear, that prisoners were subjected to medical experiments. Some were starved for weeks, just to see how long a man could survive before madness set in. Others were infected with diseases to test how the body deteriorated under extreme stress. Some were even subjected to mock executions, forced to stand before a guillotine, while the blade was deliberately stopped inches above their necks, then thrown back into their cells, left to wonder if the next time would be real. One of the most chilling reports from Bicêtre prison was the use of the cage of silence. A prisoner would be locked inside a pitch-black, soundproof chamber, completely cut off from any human interaction. No light, no voices, no sense of time. Prisoners left in the cage of silence for too long often emerged completely broken, either reduced to catatonic states or raving with insanity. One survivor, after being released from Bicêtre, was later found wandering the streets of Paris, mumbling the names of the people he had seen executed, convinced that he was already dead. But even these horrors were nothing compared to what was happening in the conciergerie, the final stop before the guillotine. If someone was sent to the conciergerie, they were already dead. The prison was known as the waiting room of death, where prisoners spent their final days before execution. It was designed not just to imprison people, but to break them completely before they died. Prisoners were forced to watch their fellow inmates dragged to the guillotine, knowing their turn was next. Each night, the guards would walk down the halls marking the names of those who would die the next day. Some prisoners tried to bribe the guards to remove their names. Others collapsed into despair. But the most terrifying thing about the conciergerie was the silence. Unlike the streets outside, where crowds screamed and celebrated the executions, inside the prison, the condemned rarely spoke. Survivors described the eerie quiet, as if everyone had already accepted their death long before the blade fell. One prisoner wrote, Each night I closed my eyes, knowing that I might never open them again. The only thing more unbearable than the fear was the waiting. But the most ironic and poetic fate of all was still to come, because soon, the man who had built the Reign of Terror, the man who had sent thousands to the guillotine, would find himself locked in the same cell, walking the same path, awaiting the same fate. Robespierre, the architect of the revolution, was about to be consumed by his own creation. For years, Maximilien Robespierre had ruled the revolution with an iron grip. He had been the architect of the Reign of Terror, the mastermind behind the mass executions, and the man who had decided who lived and who died. Under his rule, France had become a nation of fear. He had executed nobles, priests, commoners, women, children, and even his fellow revolutionaries. But paranoia is a disease, and once it infects a man, it never lets go. Robespierre saw enemies everywhere. He began to eliminate his own allies, convinced that even those closest to him were plotting against him. And when a man turns against his own, it is only a matter of time before they turn against him. By mid-1794, Robespierre had pushed France to its breaking point. The Reign of Terror had already killed tens of thousands of people, but he demanded more blood. He declared that the revolution was still under threat and that new traitors had to be found. But this time, he refused to name them. He stood before the National Convention, the revolutionary government, and announced that he had a list of conspirators, a list of men who plotted against the revolution. But he did not say who they were. Panic rippled through the assembly. Every man in the room felt his stomach drop. Every man wondered, am I on that list? For the first time, the revolutionaries felt the fear they had inflicted on so many others, and they realized something terrifying. If Robespierre was not stopped, he would kill them all. The very next day, July 27, 1794, the National Convention struck first. Robespierre arrived at the assembly, expecting to be greeted as the savior of the revolution. Instead, he was interrupted. A member of the assembly stood up and shouted, "Down with the tyrant!" The room erupted into chaos. The men who had once followed Robespierre without question now stood against him. One after another, they turned on him, shouting for his arrest. Robespierre tried to speak to defend himself, but each time he opened his mouth, his voice failed him. He had spent years delivering fiery speeches, sending thousands to their deaths. And now, at the moment of his greatest need, his voice betrayed him. The assembly voted to arrest him. The Reign of Terror was over, and now Robespierre would face the same fate as his victims. But Robespierre was not finished yet. That night, his supporters broke him out of prison and took him to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. There, he and his last remaining allies planned a final resistance, but no one came to help them. The people of Paris, who had once cheered his rise, now stood silent. They had seen enough blood. At 2 a.m., soldiers stormed the building. A gunshot rang out. Robespierre had been shot in the face. Some say he tried to kill himself, choosing to die on his own terms rather than be executed. Others say he was shot by one of the soldiers. Either way, his jaw was shattered. As he lay on the ground, bleeding and barely conscious, the soldiers dragged him away. The man who had once sent thousands to the guillotine was now being taken to his own execution. On July 28, 1794, the streets of Paris were packed with people. They had come to see the man who had ruled them with terror finally meet his end. Robespierre was led to the guillotine, his face swollen, his jaw hanging loose, wrapped in a filthy bandage. He could not speak, he could not plead for mercy. He could only watch as the executioner prepared the blade. And then, the man who had built the Reign of Terror felt the terror himself. The executioner tore the bandage from his face, exposing his shattered jaw. Robespierre let out a scream of agony. The crowd erupted in laughter. The people who had once obeyed his every word now mocked his suffering. He was placed on the scaffold, the blade was raised, and then it fell. His severed head was lifted into the air, just as he had ordered for so many others. The crowd cheered. The Reign of Terror was finally over, but France was broken beyond repair. With Robespierre dead, the execution slowed. The guillotine, once used every single day, now stood silent. The prisons, once overflowing with condemned souls, now emptied. The Reign of Terror had killed nearly 50,000 people. And for what? The revolution had promised a new world, one of liberty, equality, and justice. Instead, it had become a nightmare. The monarchy was gone, the revolutionaries were gone, and all that remained was the blood in the streets. The reign of terror had ended. The guillotine had fallen silent. The prisons had emptied. The fear that had ruled Paris for years was finally lifting. But for the people of France, the nightmare was far from over. The revolution had promised a better world, a nation built on freedom, equality, and justice. Instead, it had left behind a country in ruins. The economy was collapsing. Entire families had been wiped out. Cities were haunted by the ghosts of the dead. For those who had survived, life would never be the same. The terror had left deep scars, not just on the streets of Paris, but inside the minds of its people. For years, men and women had been forced to watch their loved ones dragged away, to hear their names read out as the next to die, to witness their executions in public squares. Some had betrayed their own families, turning in brothers, sisters, parents, and friends to save themselves. Now, they had to live with that guilt. There were stories of mothers who had screamed their children's names in their sleep, haunted by the sound of the guillotine, fathers who had once believed in the revolution, only to lose everything to it, and children who had grown up watching heads fall into baskets, their innocence stolen by the very movement that had sworn to create a better future. Even those who had once cheered for the executions now looked back in horror at what they had become. Had they really enjoyed the bloodshed? Had they really laughed as the guillotine took another life? Had they truly become monsters? The revolution had been meant to save France. Instead, it had broken it beyond repair. With Robespierre dead, the government struggled to rebuild itself. The National Convention, desperate to distance itself from the reign of terror, passed laws to end the mass executions. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The revolution had lost its original purpose. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had been drowned in blood. And just a few years later, France would fall into the hands of another ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would crown himself emperor, replacing the monarchy that the revolutionaries had fought so hard to destroy. The great experiment in democracy had failed, and the people of France had paid the price. Even after the reign of terror ended, the guillotine remained. For decades, it continued to be France's official method of execution. The machine that had killed kings, queens, revolutionaries, and commoners alike continued to take lives well into the 20th century. It was not until 1977, nearly 200 years after the revolution, that the guillotine was finally abandoned. By then, the blood of the past had already seeped too deep into the soil of France. And though the executions had stopped, the terror had never truly disappeared. Even today, the echoes of that time still haunt the streets of Paris. The revolution had promised a new world. Instead, it had given France a history written in blood. The French Revolution began with a dream. It was supposed to free the people from oppression, to bring down a corrupt monarchy, to give power back to the citizens. But instead, it had become a war against itself. It had promised justice, but delivered fear. It had promised liberty, but enforced control. It had promised equality, but created mass executions. And in the end, no one was spared. The revolution had killed the king. It had killed the queen. It had killed the nobles. It had killed the revolutionaries themselves. It had devoured its own creators, leaving nothing behind but death, destruction, and regret. And though the reign of terror ended in 1794, its horrors were never forgotten. Even today, the French Revolution remains one of the bloodiest uprisings in human history. A time when justice turned to vengeance, when freedom became slavery, when brothers became executioners, and when the people of France became prisoners of their own revolution. This was the true cost of the French Revolution, a cost measured in blood,